Father, we just thank you in advance for what you have for us this evening, Lord. We thank you for a time of worship. We just ask now, Lord, you would shine a light on your word, and Lord, help us to find application for our lives out of these stories. Lord, they're dark stories. They're tragic stories. But Lord, your word always has something. Lord, if we're looking, if we're listening, if we're asking. So Lord, tonight we ask that you would show us what you have for us. And we ask that in Jesus' name. Amen. So by way of confession, I have been struggling in the study of this book. Because when I study, I'm always asking the Lord to show application. And in most cases, I think when we go through studies here, we have lots of application. And I know there's application here. There's no doubt in my mind. But sometimes I think it's hard to see through just the weight of these stories. Just the tragic nature sort of wears on you. You kind of know, okay, it's good for the next 30 seconds, and then it's going to go bad again. And so I just want to put that out there because I don't want the enemy stealing what we have here. So I just wanted to confess that outwardly. And we just need to be praying over this book because there's a reason we're going through. I've taught it before, and I've never struggled like I'm struggling in it this time. Because it is tragic. It is tragic that people, and I don't want to just look backwards in this. I want us to look right now. It's just so tragic that, I guess in the simplest of terms, we know better. We know better. We know the truth, most of us. Most of us have been through the word before, and we struggle. And I think it only can take us by surprise that we struggle if we don't understand the nature of the world that we live in and truly accept it for what it is. You know, we're told to redeem the time. We're told that the world that we're in is wicked. We know the story from the beginning, what happened in the garden and how that has just permeated all of time as we know it. That this is evil. And the only good thing in the midst of this life is Jesus, is God. And we don't ever really get to see the light here until we've seen that. We may have thought we saw the light previous, but it was a counterfeit. It wasn't real. And every once in a while, we still have our attention taken by something that's not real, that's counterfeit. And we look away from the truth because this or that fascinates us. But I think the only way we can reckon this book for ourselves, well, I'll tell you what I kind of saw today as I was considering it, and this is maybe a little bit, I don't know how to classify it, just use your imagination. But you know, with all that known about this world that we live in, that all of that potential for evil exists, and that evil's going on all the time, we sort of move through that always at risk. You know, we're told that we walk through the valley of the shadow of death. And there's just that shadow's always there being cast. And we walk through this world sort of always at risk of stumbling into what's all around us. And yet we're told that we're to have this path which God's word shines a light onto so that we won't stumble, that our feet will follow the ways that he has for us. But we're also told that that way is extremely narrow and only few will find it. And so I think if anything, as grim as some of these stories are, as violent as some of these stories are, as many times as you might ask, why does Hollywood have trouble finding scripts? Why do we have the umpteenth sequel to whatever when all these stories exist? But as we move through it, I think we just need to see that these men, and sometimes women, are just walking right into that which is all around us. And they're deciding to bow down to it. They're deciding to show allegiance to it. They're deciding to follow it instead of our Heavenly Father. And it always leads to disaster. It always leads to tragedy. And in the midst of all of that, there's this shining light. God who loves us. who even for these Israelites, he continuously puts out his arms and he says, come on back. Come on back. But it doesn't get easier for them, and the consequences of their decisions never end. And they just keep complicating. And that's what we do. We complicate things. We pile on ourselves our decisions and the consequences that come from those decisions. And then we wonder. We look around and we find ourselves like Gideon, stuck down inside a wine press trying to make something good come up. And I guess like John said so many times in his epistles, we don't have to. That's the amazing thing. We don't have to sin. We don't have to be in all these complicated situations. We don't have to have so many consequences following us through our lives, because we have choices. And everything we need to know about going the right path is laid out in this book. And so that's just some things that have been on my heart as I'm studying, and I'm asking the Lord for ways that we can come to this book and really glean and try to rise above the darkness and the tragedy to see our own kind of straight path through this life. You know, Gideon, he becomes more and more of a complex character the more I study him. And we're going to come out of his life into the life of one of his sons, Abimelech, tonight. And I wish we could go all the way through the story of Abimelech, because it would be so much easier to do his whole story at once. But probably some of you want to go to sleep tonight. Because it's about 5 chapters worth of stuff. And you know me, I would, but I'm not. But I'm not sure where we're going to end either tonight. But isn't it interesting that Gideon had this experience where he goes into this battle with 32,000 troops against 135,000 others, and God, I think sort of in his sense of humor, but also in his wisdom and in his ability to bring the glory to himself, which it's always his, pares them down to 300 men. And now we come into a part of the story where there's only 15,000 of that 135,000 left. But Gideon, and let's not separate ourselves too far from this story, Gideon, having seen that, decides he needs help beyond God's. And that's where we get in trouble. I know I've done it so many times. I'm in a new situation and I somehow can't remember the last time God showed up. Or somehow I'm arguing with the fact that he would show up in this when he was so faithful in the last thing that happened. And so we hear this call go out from Gideon. The last chapter we finished, chapter 7, verse 24, says, Then Gideon sent messengers throughout all the mountains of Ephraim, saying, Come down against the Midianites and seize from them the watering places as far as Beth Barah and the Jordan. So having done all he had done with 300, we might be able to empathize and say, okay, I mean, he's weary, and we're going to see that in this text tonight. I mean, he's weary. Why wouldn't he be? I mean, he's chasing through the land after these Midianites, after having defeated so many of them. But now, after seeing what the Lord had handed him, calls for others. So we have to wonder, and this is what we always must wonder, and we'll very seldom have an answer for it. What's in this man's heart? What is it right now that's motivating this drive that he has? Because he wants to do things seemingly in his own strength at this point. That almost there's an agenda of his that doesn't maybe line up with the agenda that God had here. And he's so desperate to get that agenda fulfilled that he's going to pull in whatever resources he can beyond the ones that God has already shown him. And I think we'll see that unfold tonight too, that there's something else going on in Gideon's heart. And when we observe, even brothers and sisters in the church, and we watch them do certain things that might cause us question, we don't know. We can't judge their hearts. It's hard enough to judge my own heart. And I dare not try to judge someone else's. But there's always a motivation. People have a lot within them that is going on that drive them to different things. And I think Gideon has a very somewhat hidden past, one that we're not going to clearly get to because we don't have all the information. But I think there's hints But there was a lot going on with Gideon. Verse 1 of chapter 8 says, "Now the men of Ephraim said to him, 'Why have you done this to us by not calling us when you went to fight with the Midianites?' And they reprimanded him sharply. So he said to them, 'What have I done now in comparison with you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer? God has delivered into your hands the princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeeb. And what was I able to do in comparison with you?' Then their anger toward him subsided when he said that." Now that's an interesting conversation that went on, and we're going to see something later, maybe not tonight, but there's a thing about Ephraim here. Ephraim, this tribe, this people, are very prideful. And what they're seeking here, and it will be proven when the second time we see a similar event, is they're prideful and they're interested in having the glory that really should only belong to the Lord. And they've come here saying that they weren't invited to the fight. And then Gideon becomes a politician. And what does he do? He heaps, in a sense, false praise on them in order to de-escalate this conversation. And it's interesting because I read a bunch of different commentators, and they all think that this was really good on Gideon's part, that he took the high road. And it's interesting because almost every one of those commentators quoted a particular proverb. Let me read that proverb to you. Proverb chapter 15, verse 1. It says, "A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger." Now we could certainly apply that here, that he decided to have a soft word to de-escalate. But I would challenge that. I mean, he should have, in a sense, and you'll see again when this situation creeps back by the same group, later chapter, that he should have let them know. I mean, this is the Lord's. Do you know what the Lord just did? And you're coming in here because you weren't part of this. It also should have caused Gideon to stop and wonder why he invited anybody. So there should have been a little bit of self-conviction here as well. So I don't think he de-escalated it by giving a soft hand. I think he just didn't want to deal with it. And there was a lot he could have said. Verse 4, "When Gideon came to the Jordan, he and the 300 men who were with him crossed over, exhausted, but still in pursuit." Now, we should have no trouble believing they were exhausted. 300 against 32,000, 15,000 left to pursue. They crossed the river, which is probably a difficult task just by itself. They're exhausted, but still in pursuit. So hats off to them, and a reminder for all of us that we should not grow weary in doing good. That we are to be those that would pursue, that we would continue on the path that God has set for us, even when we're tired. But you know, there's an inherent danger in being tired. Now, we need to make sure that we're walking in the strength that the Lord gives us, because His resources are endless. But sometimes when we lean upon our own, then we do draw into a place of tiredness. And there's a warning there, because that's when we can make mistakes. That's where we can trip over ourselves, when we haven't taken care of ourselves. And so as much as the Lord's strength may carry us through those times of human weakness, we also need to understand our own person, our own weaknesses, those times where we need to stop and take care of ourselves. Because have you not, if you've been around churches a long time, if you've been around ministries for a long time, have you not seen people that have wore themselves down because they're doing it in their own strength? And there's an inherent danger there. One that we all would need, just as brothers and sisters, to be watching others and be able to intercede if necessary so people take care of themselves. You know, it's interesting, part of my past life when I was in the military, I had a season where I went into a special program in the military and became an addictions counselor. And one of the things that we used to talk about with people, and it was a secular setting, I mean, it was hard really bringing the word into that setting, although I did as much as I could get away with. But one of the concepts that we taught those that were struggling with addictions was this one acronym, and the acronym was HALT, H-A-L-T. And if you know anything about these programs, that you probably may have heard that before. But HALT, it was a warning, and what it stands for is hungry, angry, lonely, tired. And I'm not trying to bring the world into our scripture study tonight, but it makes sense because those four things can lead to bad decisions. I mean, if you're overly hungry, if you got anger you haven't dealt with, if you're lonely or tired, more tired than you should be, your decisions aren't always wise. And so I think we don't grow weary in doing well, one, because we lean on the Lord and His strength first and foremost. But we also have to realize this human body needs care. Verse 5, then he said to the men of Sukkoth, please give loaves of bread to the people who follow me, for they are exhausted, and I am pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, king of Midian. And the leaders of Sukkoth said, are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna now in your hand, that we should give bread to your army? So Gideon said, for this cause, when the Lord has delivered Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, then I will tear your flesh with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars. Then he went up from there to Penuel and spoke to them in the same way, and the men of Penuel answered him as the men of Sukkoth had answered. So he also spoke to them of Penuel, saying, when I come back in peace, I will tear down this tower. And so recognizing that their human bodies needed some human fuel, he went to these two nearby towns, which in a sense he and his men were fighting for, and he asked of them sustenance. And they were denied because they didn't have the confidence in what Gideon was yet to do. And they felt, if we give you what you asked for and then you lose, then those that we fight against are going to come after us for supporting you. And so with complete confidence in what God had called them to, Gideon says in verse 7, for this cause, when the Lord has delivered into my hand, then I will. So he's confident that things are going to go as God said and that he'll be back. But it isn't interesting that he doesn't give a testimony for what the Lord's done. He doesn't defend the Lord in the sense of, do you know what we've already done? Have you seen the Lord's hand, what he's already brought about? No, he just lashes out at him in a sense and says, I'm going to punish you for this decision. And we could go back and forth trying to justify or not justify what he's decided to do. I mean, was this the Lord's will that he would come back and do these cruel things to them because they weren't fed? Would that be the Lord's will? We certainly, just like the fact that he called these other groups in to help, we didn't see the Lord tell him to do that. And we certainly don't see the instruction of the Lord here that he would have this retribution on them for not helping. So again, I say that there's an agenda here. There's something motivating Gideon. There's something really pushing him now. Not so much to just kill and get rid of the rest of 15,000. It's actually as if he's being spurred by something else. And I think we're going to discover that here shortly. In verse 10, now Zebah and Zalmunna were at Karkor, and their armies with them, about 15,000, all who were left of all the army of the people of the east. The 120,000 men who drew the sword had fallen. Then Gideon went up by the road of those who dwell in the tents of the east of Nebah and Jogbehah, and he attacked the army while the camps felt secure. When Zebah and Zalmunna fled, he pursued them, and he took the two kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, and routed the whole army. So he separates these two characters out, and he continues on his military excursion. Verse 13, then Gideon the son of Joash returned from battle from the ascent of Heres. And he caught a young man of the men of Sukkoth and interrogated him, and he wrote down for him the leaders of Sukkoth and its elders, 77 men. Then he came to the men of Sukkoth and said, here are Zebah and Zalmunna, about whom you ridiculed me, saying, are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna now in your hand, that we should give bread to your weary men? And he took the elders of the city and the thorns of wilderness and briars, and with them he taught the men of Sukkoth. Then he tore down the tower of Penuel and killed the men of the city. And so he comes back after having his battle. He gets this list by a spy, in a sense, of the 77 elders. He goes after them. And then he goes back to these two towns and he said, aren't these the ones that I said I would have success over, and yet you refused to give us the supplies that we needed? Verse 18, and he said to Zebah and Zalmunna, what kind of men were they whom you killed at Tabor? So he starts to interrogate these two. And here's where part of our answer to the motivation of Gideon comes, I believe. So they answered, as you are, so were they. Each one resembled the son of a king. Then he said, they were my brothers, the sons of my mother. As the Lord lives, if you had let them live, I would not kill you. And he said to Jethro, his firstborn, rise, kill them. But the youth would not draw a sword, for he was afraid because he was still a youth. So Zebah and Zalmunna said, rise yourself and kill us, for as a man is, so is his strength. So Gideon arose and killed Zebah and Zalmunna and took the crescent ornaments that were on their camels' necks. So he has this conversation when he says to these guys, he says, when you were there at Tabor, tell me about the men that you killed. And they said, they were like you, they were like sons of a king. Something about Gideon here that we're not going to get the answer to. But I really wonder who Gideon's father really was. Because isn't it interesting that Gideon, when Gideon came and he tore down the high place and he tore down the idol, and they came to his father's house and they said, bring out your son that we might kill him. And he kind of opposed them in the sense of almost like he didn't believe in that God either. Because he said, if that God was so offended, let him take care of it. And so we see that there's a possibility here that maybe Gideon was of some sort of royal line. He was in that wine press and he says, what could I do, Lord? He says, my tribe's now the least of Manasseh, and I'm the least amongst my brothers. And here it would appear that at least one of the wives of his father had him and two other older brothers that were killed in this exchange. So I bring this up because I think part of the agenda that Gideon had was one of avengement. He was avenging his brothers, and he was being driven by that fire, which maybe took him outside the lines of what God had set. And so he was mad at them because they were slowing him down in his own endeavor. He called the others into the battle because there was only 15,000 left, but he had to bring this avenging of his brothers' deaths. But it's interesting, they recognized something in Gideon, that he was as the son of a king, and that his brothers were as the sons of kings. Something there marked them. Something there was known about them. Something that they understood in their culture, in their time, which, again, we don't have the full. And isn't it interesting that he tried to get the son, the youngest, to kill, and I think, again, because it was a family matter. I think it was because it was a family matter. And his son, of course, just afraid in his young age to do so. So these men knew their guilt, and they said, you kill us. You be the man, and you kill us. And it's interesting, we're going to see this a couple times. Look what he took from them. And this is just a side note. It interests me. He took the crescent ornaments. Isn't that interesting? When you consider Islam today and the crescent and how that's part of their symbol. I don't know what that means. It's just kind of interesting. Verse 22, then the men of Israel said to Gideon, rule over us, both you and your son and your grandson also, for you have delivered us from the hand of Midian. So it would make sense that they would have this conquering general, if you will, to be their leader. I mean, we've seen it in our own time, in our own country. The great military leaders have come back to be presidents of our country. But again, I think this lends to this other thing that we don't have all the answers to. That he would seem like a natural choice to be a king. I wish I had all the answers to that. But this does show us something very interesting, that the call for a king by these people was very early on. We think about it when we come into Samuel. When we get into the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, we see them say that we want a king, we want to be like all the nations around us. And yet that call for a king comes much earlier than Samuel. And depending upon what his father was, maybe there was a kingship there we don't really have a story about. Probably because it's not important to us, but I can't help my curiosity. Verse 23, but Gideon said to them, I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. So there we all stand. We applaud. Gideon did good, but then he does really bad. Because he says, I won't be a king. He rightly points to God and says, God will be your king. But then he immediately does what? He acts like a king. Verse 24, then Gideon said to them, I would like to make a request of you, that each of you would give me the earrings from his plunder. For they had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites. So they answered, we will gladly give them. And they spread out a garment, and each man threw into it the earrings from the plunder. Now the weight of the gold earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, besides the crescent ornaments, pendants, and purple robes which were on the kings of the Midian, and besides that the chains that were around the camels' necks. Wow. That sounds a lot like a payment. It sounds a lot like a tax that a king would give to the people. There's a lot of money here. If you don't count everything after shekels of gold, and you just count the shekels of gold, this is 50 pounds of gold. I went and looked at today's gold prices, $1,314, some change. So 1,050,000 and change of today's dollars. That's a lot of money. And so we see this heart of Gideon that's almost king-like after saying the right thing about the Lord shall rule over you. And as if that isn't enough, verse 27, then Gideon made it into an ephod. And he set it up in his city, Ophrah, and all Israel played the harlot with it there. It became a snare to Gideon and to his house. Thus Midian was subdued before the children of Israel, so that they lifted their heads no more, and the country was quieted for 40 years in the days of Gideon. Now this is odd, and we're going to be left with more questions than answers. But he takes what it seems was some of the gold, and he melts it into an ephod, which we know from Exodus was one of the priestly garbs that was designed by God's own design. It was sort of an apron sort thing, and in the front of that was all the stones, if you remember, by which decisions were made to align with the will of God. And he makes this ephod, and notice the words, they're very, very important. He set it up in the city. He put it as a place that would be seen, and we can infer to be worshipped. And it says, and the people played harlot with that ephod. So they became, and again, back to idol worship in a way. And what was Gideon trying to prove? He says, I'm not a king, but here he's acting like a priest. And he sets this thing before him. And some have surmised that maybe he was trying to get the ire of the Ephraims, the ones that challenged him for not inviting them in. Because at this time, where was the tabernacle? Where was all of those elements of the tabernacle? They were in Shiloh, which was where? In Ephraim. And it was almost like he was pulling away the allegiance and the worship in the tabernacle to the true God, where the ark was at, into a situation that was right at his feet, and gave them something to worship there instead of going to the true source. I think one other thing we see here is the snares of liberty versus the focus during warfare. We talk a lot about spiritual warfare. And all of us, if we were told what line to get in to never have it again, would fill that queue up pretty fast. But the fact is we're always in warfare. But if we can change our minds about warfare, we'd probably come away with the conclusion we're a lot better off when we're at war than when we're at rest. Because when we're at rest, that's when other things creep in. That's when worse decisions are often made. Now, we need times of rest. But sometimes when things, as you know and I know very well, that in those times where things seem to be going really well, that's when we can get really tripped up. And so isn't it interesting, they come out of this season of warfare into this season of liberty, and they don't know what to do, in a sense, with all their energy. And they make bad mistakes. It's not easy for warriors to rest. Warriors do crazy things when they're at rest. And I think that feeds into this a little bit. And again, I think we should take that focus for ourselves sometimes, is to see the warfare, see this world that we walk through that I started off talking about, understanding that that risk is everywhere and that shadow of death is everywhere and that evil is everywhere. And I need to always, in a sense, with my head on a swivel, be engaging that and realize I'm probably safer there than just totally throwing my arms up and jumping in the spiritual hammock and feeling like I'm okay. Because that's when the enemy sneaks up. It's better to do something with that spiritual adrenaline, to put it to work instead of letting it all stack up and then it just spills over in stupid ways. You know, one of my only brother, one of my brother's best friends was a Green Beret in the Army during the first Gulf War. And they took a pretty big, I don't remember the count, it was hundreds of them they were taken over to Kuwait. They were brought a little ways in country to Iraq, and they literally warehoused them. They literally put them in a warehouse. And they were like almost literally sitting in the dark. That war, if you remember, lasted 100 hours. Well, actually it's still going on, but that conflict lasted 100 hours. And I want you to picture, if you could, just in your imagination, being one of those guys, ready to do what you've been trained to do, the adrenaline running through their body, the readiness factor. And then 100 hours later, somebody comes and slides open a huge door on the side of the warehouse. Middle Eastern sun comes pouring in and they say, "We didn't need you." Those guys were messed up. They were messed up. You think about warfare causing PTSD, that can cause PTSD. What do you do with all that adrenaline? And so sometimes I think spiritually we need to be willing to fight it, and as much as we can get out of the warehouse and let God use us. Sometimes we just let that build up and we think we're okay, and we're just a lot more at peace when we can hide behind something and not face the warfare. But again, I think it's those times of rest that can get us in trouble. Verse 29, then Jerubbaal, the son of Joash, another name, remember, for Gideon, went and dwelt in his own house. Gideon had 70 sons who were his own offspring, for he had many wives. And his concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, whose name he called Abimelech. Now Gideon, the son of Joash, died at a good old age and was buried in the tomb of Joash his father in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. So there may have been another reason, I say with humor, that Gideon needed all that money. He had 71 kids and wives. Now that's interesting too, because that would have been the way of a king. That would have been the life of a king. Because very often those wives were taken to make a relationship with another tribe. And just in case you think 71 is a big number, this won't account for all the daughters. This would have just been the sons mentioned because of the nature of Old Testament scripture. So who knows how many kids he had, or how he had time to have that many kids. But it's interesting, this one son who was from a different woman, actually a servant woman to his father, named Abimelech. Now you got to wonder, again, the motivation of Gideon in the naming of this son. His name is Abimelech, which means my father, a king. Interesting. Again, there's a lot going on below the surface that we don't have answers to, but I see a lot of motivation for some of the things that has happened. And so Gideon passes at a good old age, it tells us. Verse 33, so it was as soon as Gideon was dead, here it goes, the children of Israel again played the harlot with the Baals and made Baal-berith their god. Thus the children of Israel did not remember the Lord their God, who had delivered them from the hands of all their enemies on every side, nor did they show kindness to the house of Jerubbaal in accordance with the good he had done for Israel. Bam! That quick. And remember, this book covers almost 500 years of the same pattern, in and out of obedience. Not only in and out of obedience or from obedience to disobedience, but it tells us here to the point of forgetting. But then you remember and you think about all the way through the Old Testament, God continuously says to his people, I am the one that brought you up out of Egypt. I am the one that came against the gods of Egypt for you. Because they needed to be reminded. We need to be reminded of that last thing that God did, of that great thing that God did, so that we know. So they return to this worship of the Baals. And remember that word Baal, amongst some other subtle definitions, means husband. And so when we see it said that these people played the harlot, it's because they're what they are is in the process of infidelity. Because God, the true God of heaven, is their husband, should be. They, his bride, just like the church is the bride of Christ. When we go after other things and we marry ourselves, if you will, to those other things, it's as if we're playing the harlot. Our fidelity has been broken with the Lord. And in this time we see another word added, Baal Berith. Berith means covenant. So this is Baal of the covenant. They made a covenant with Baal. It's deeper this time. It wasn't enough that they just bowed down and worshiped him before. This time they've made a covenant with him. It's easy to see how they would have forgot. Jump into chapter 9. Then Abimelech, the son of Jerubbaal, went to Shechem to his mother's brothers and spoke with them with all the family of the house of his mother's father, saying, Please speak in the hearing of all the men of Shechem, which is better for you, that all 70 of the sons of Jerubbaal reign over you, or that one reign over you? Remember that I am your own flesh and bone. So he goes back to the family of the mother that he came from, and now he's making a case that he be set up as the king. And he seems to allude to the fact that you're either going to put up with 70 of Gideon's sons trying to take this position, or you can just decide now to follow me, and that'll be a lot easier than trying to follow the other 70. And then he reminds them, I'm of your own flesh and blood. Verse 3, And his mother's brothers spoke all these words concerning him in the hearing of the men of Shechem, and their heart was inclined to follow Abimelech, for they said, He is our brother. So they gave him 70 shekels of silver from the temple of Baal Berith, with which Abimelech hired worthless and reckless men. And they followed him. Then he went to his father's house, Ophrah, and killed his brothers, the 70 sons of Jerubbaal, on one stone. But Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, was left because he hid himself. And all the men of Shechem gathered together, all of Beth Millo, and they went and made Abimelech king beside the terebinth tree at the pillar that was in Shechem. Now remember Shechem, interesting place. We studied it earlier there towards the end of Joshua, where that ancient city sat between the two mountains, Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. And from there they pronounced the blessings and the curses, if you recall. And it worked like a natural amphitheater, and the voice went out from there so that all could hear the speaking and the refrain. And now we're back in that setting, and it's being used for a very dark purpose, as if those curses that were pronounced then are having their way now through these people. They weren't interested in the blessings. And now this youngest of the sons hides himself and survives the murder of all the other brothers. And it says on a single stone, which I imagine maybe they, decapitated them there or just ran them through, I don't know, but it was in a single location. Quite an ugly mess. But now this young one, he comes and he brings this parable. We're used to thinking about parables in the New Testament. Here's a parable in the Old Testament. Verse 7, Now when they told Jotham, he went and stood on the top of Mount Gerizim and lifted his voice and cried out, and he said to them, Listen to me, you men of Shechem, that God may listen to you. The trees once went forth to anoint a king over them, and they said to the olive tree, Reign over us. But the olive tree said to them, Should I cease giving my oil with which they honor God and men and go to sway over trees? Then the trees said to the fig tree, you come and reign over us. But the fig tree said to them, should I cease my sweetness and my good fruit and go to sway over trees? Then the trees said to the vine, you come and reign over us. But the vine said to them, should I cease my new wine, which cheers both God and men, and go to sway over trees? Then all the trees said to the bramble, you come and reign over us. And the bramble said to the trees, if in truth you anoint me as a king over you, then come and take shelter in my shade, and if not, let fire come out of the bramble and devour the cedars of Lebanon. And so they weren't able to get these notable ones to lead, but they came with this one that is equated to bramble, Abimelech. And basically, for them to come under him as their leader, they would end up being devoured like the cedars of Lebanon with fire. And we'll see that unfold. God promises it through this parable, and we'll see that entire thing unfold in the life of Abimelech. Verse 16, now therefore if you have acted in truth and sincerity in making Abimelech king, and if you have dealt with, and this is the same young man continuing to speak, and if you have dealt with Jerubbaal and his house and have done to him as he deserves, for my father fought for you, risked his life, and delivered you out of the hand of Midian. But you have risen up against my father's house this day, and killed his 70 sons on one stone, and made Abimelech the son of his female servant king over the men of Shechem, because he is your brother. If then you have acted in truth and sincerity with Jerubbaal and with his house this day, then rejoice in Abimelech, and let him also rejoice in you. But if not, let fire come from Abimelech and devour the men of Shechem and Beth Millo. And let fire come from the men of Shechem and from Beth Millo and devour Abimelech. And Jotham ran away and fled. And he went to Beer and dwelt there for fear of Abimelech his brother. So he brings this parable, in a sense, a prophecy as well. And he sets up the conditions. If you've done well with my father, or my grandfather in his case, if you've done well with him and you've done well with his household, then fear not and follow this man. But if you haven't, which they didn't, prepare yourselves. Then we get into the results of that prophecy, verse 22. After Abimelech had reigned over Israel 3 years, God sent a spirit of ill will between Abimelech and the men of Shechem. And the men of Shechem dealt treacherously with Abimelech. Now the King James for verse 23 says that God sent an evil spirit. And I know some people get chills when they think about things like that, but there's nothing that God does not have control of. And there's nothing that God cannot use for his own will. But he set this spirit of division between Abimelech and the people that were following him. And it's just God's will here that he sets Abimelech up for the fall that he deserves, because we're told that vengeance is the Lord's. If Gideon had understood that, it would have went a lot better for him. Verse 24, that the crime done to the 70 sons of Jerubbaal might be settled, and their blood be laid on Abimelech their brother who killed them, on the men of Shechem who aided him in the killing of his brothers. And the men of Shechem set men in ambush against him on the tops of the mountains, and they robbed all who paused by them along the way, and it was told Abimelech. Now Gaal, the son of Ebed, came with his brothers and went over to Shechem, and the men of Shechem put their confidence in him. So they went out into the fields and gathered grapes from their vineyards and trod them, made merry, and they went into the house of their God and ate and drank and cursed Abimelech. So they go and they make their wine and they drink in the house of their God, and they prepare themselves to go against Abimelech. Verse 28, and then Gaal, the son of Ebed, said, who is Abimelech, and who is Shechem that we should serve him? Is he son of Jerubbaal and not Zebul his officer? Serve the men of Hamor, the father of Shechem, but why should we serve him? If only this people were under my authority, then I would remove Abimelech. So he said to Abimelech, increase your army and come out. Then Zebul, the ruler of the city, heard the words of Gaal, the son of Ebed. His anger was aroused, and he sent messengers to Abimelech secretly, saying, take note, Gaal, the son of Ebed, and his brothers have come to Shechem, and here they are fortifying the cities against you. Now therefore get up by night, you and the people who are with you, and lie in wait in the field. And it shall be, as soon as the sun is up in the morning, that you shall rise early and rush upon the city when he and the people who are with him come out against you. You may then do to them as you find opportunity. This is sort of just a story, and it's an interesting story, and it's a complex story. But if we want to see God's hand in this, then we need to see God's hand in the complexity. I always think about how God can arrange for so many people to all be involved in one thing, unknowing of one another. So many people just, doing this and doing that, and yet it all connects. And that shouldn't be a surprise, and that shouldn't be something we see as an exception, because if we believe God is sovereign, then that's happening all the time with all of us. Even the non-believers of the world, because God created them and uses them as well. Which, in a sense, should give us some peace about the things that we see, knowing that God's in charge. And it's all being played out exactly how he wants it to be. But for me, it's one of the mind blowers about God, that he can have all those individual players all getting one thing done. I think of an old joke about the two men sitting on the airplane and friends, and the one guy's totally calm and waiting for the plane to take off, and the other guy's a nervous wreck. And finally his friend looks at him and goes, "What is wrong with you?" He's like, "Well, man, what if the plane crashes? I mean, what if that happens?" And he's like, "Well, you know what? I mean, if it's your time, it's your time. Okay?" And the guy sat there thinking, and he looked at his friend and he goes, "What if it's the pilot's time?" It's a good question, because I think about that just even in something as tragic as an airplane crash. Did God have that in order for everyone on that plane? I don't know. So there again, what's happening around you in your life? What is God doing with all of the characters in your life? And here's a helpful hint. Don't try to guess. There's a real good chance you're going to be wrong. But that's exciting. Just to consider that God's working out all of these things with all of these people that somehow don't seem either very important or affecting me, but God's working out something. And how many times have you got to the working out point and went, that's what all that was about? He did this, and then that happened, and this. We have those stories, right? And we're like amazed. But then another time we're standing there like we're just lonely in the middle of the desert, thinking God has nothing to do with what's going on with us. That's never true. Never true. I have no idea where it does. Where'd I stop? So Abimelech and all the people who were with him rose by night and lay in wait against Shechem in 4 companies. When Gaal, the son of Ebed, went out and stood in the entrance of the city gate, Abimelech and the people who were with him rose from lying in wait. And when Gaal saw the people, he said to Zebul, "Look, people are coming down from the tops of the mountains." But Zebul said to him, "You see the shadows of the mountains as if they were men." So Gaal spoke again and said, "See, people are coming down from the center of the land, and another company is coming from the diviner's terebinth tree." Then Zebul said, "Where indeed is your mouth now, with which you said, 'Who is Abimelech, that we should serve him?' Are not these the people whom you despised? Go out, if you will, and fight with them now." So Gaal went out, leading the men of Shechem, and fought with Abimelech. And Abimelech chased him, and he fled from him, and many fell wounded to the very entrance of the gate. Then Abimelech dwelt in Arumah, and Zebul drove out Gaal and his brothers so that they would not dwell in Shechem. And it came about on the next day that the people went out into the field, and they told Abimelech, we don't know why they went into the field. They may have went to work. They may have went to get the spoils of the battle the day prior. Verse 43, and so he took the people, divided them into 3 companies, and lay in wait in the field. And he looked, and there were the people coming out of the city, and he rose against them and attacked them. Then Abimelech and the company that was with him rushed forward and stood at the entrance of the gate of the city, and the other 2 companies rushed upon all who were within the fields and killed them. So Abimelech fought against the city all that day. He took the city and killed the people who were with it, and he demolished the city and sowed it with salt. Another tragic end. He sowed it with salt because his desire was that it would never be usable for anyone, by anyone for anything. Because if he sowed the land with salt, nothing could be grown. So not only did he kill the people and take down the city, he ruined the very land that it was on. Verse 46, now when all the men of the tower of Shechem had heard that, they entered the stronghold of the temple of the god of Berith. And it was told Abimelech that all the men of the tower of Shechem were gathered together. Then Abimelech went up to Mount Zalmon, he and all the people were with him. And Abimelech took an axe in his hand and cut down a bough from the trees and took it and laid it on his shoulder. Then he said to the people who were with him, what you have seen me do, make haste and do as I have done. So each of the people likewise cut down his own bough and followed Abimelech, put them against the stronghold and set the stronghold on fire above them, so that the people of the tower of Shechem died, about 1,000 men and women. Isn't it interesting that we're told in Scripture that the Lord is our strong tower, and that we get to run into him and be safe or saved? And here these took it upon themselves to run into a tower of a god of their own making, and it was only tragedy. Verse 50, then Abimelech went to Thebes, and he encamped against Thebes and took it. And there was a strong tower in the city, and all the men and women, all the people of the city fled there and shut themselves in. Then they went up to the top of the tower. So Abimelech came as far as the tower and fought against it. He drew near the door of the tower and burned it with fire. Kind of a repeat. But a certain woman dropped an upper millstone on Abimelech's head and crushed his skull. Then he called quickly to the young man, his armor bearer, and said to him, draw your sword and kill me, lest men say of me, a woman killed him. So his young man thrust him through, and he died. And when the men of Israel saw that Abimelech was dead, they departed, every man to his place. His pride, even in death, that it would not be claimed that he was killed by a woman, and he has his own armor bearer pierce him through. Isn't it interesting that we see this kind of personification of evil in this personality of Abimelech? And we think about what God promised in the 3rd chapter, 15th verse of Genesis, when he said he would put enmity between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. And he said that you will bruise his heel, the Savior's heel, and he will crush your head. And we see that kind of played out here in this character. Not that it was the end of that prophecy, but it was at least an example. Verse 56, thus God repaid the wickedness of Abimelech, which he had done to his father by killing his 70 brothers. And all the evil of the men of Shechem God returned to their own heads, and on them came the curse of Jotham, the son of Jerubbaal. So I don't want to, but we're going to rest there tonight. Otherwise, I have to take you through 3 more chapters. I don't know if